we'll crack on with our first panel. So if I can have our panelists up here, please. So Dr. Eddie Malloy, the Director of Advanced Organization and former Chairperson of Mental Health Reform. Robert McCafferty, mental health activist and board member with Mental Health Reform. And Caroline McGrath, barrister and former CEO of Mental Health Reform. So maybe you have a seat there. Okay, so our first panel this morning will explore the key moments of the past 10 years for mental health reform and what have been the successes, how were they achieved and what lessons were learned. Each speaker will share their insights with their involvement with MHR. So if I can just say a little bit about our panelists. So Eddie Malloy, Dr. Eddie Malloy has been an independent management consultant for over 45 years, specializing in strategy, organization structure, large-scale change, and innovation. And as I was saying, he's a dream radio guest because you can literally ask Eddie one question and then just walk away. Go off and make a cup of tea, and Eddie will still be, because there's wealth of experience and knowledge that she's going to share with us. And we're also joined by Caroline McGrath, who is a practicing barrister since 2008. And she has a diverse practice and is on the panel of chairpersons of mental health tribunals. And then, of course, we're joined by Robert McCafferty, who is a passionate about fairness and equality for service users. And in recent years, you've been very passionate around how people in crisis access mental health services through A&E. So we'll hear more about more of that. So Eddie, first off, my question to you is really going back to the beginning. Can you talk to us through your motivation as chairman of MHR during those first few years when mental health reform really came together? What was the gap that MHR addressed, and what were the building blocks that were put in place which made mental health reform such a success that we are now 10 years later celebrating its 10th anniversary?
First of all, it's good to be here.
Yeah.
Am I on?
Yep, you're on.
Okay. It's very good to be here and see some old friends. The gap it was spelled out earlier by Fiona, the fragmentation of, we call it the sector, and the need for a unifying voice, and also the need for an authoritative voice. We needed a go-to for government, for the media. There wasn't a go-to for the government and the media. And the other thing I would underscore is holding the government to account. And that means that you always have to have an edge to the relationship with the government. Now, Caroline and I have discussed the history a bit in advance of this session so that we don't duplicate. Caroline has a much better handle on the early history than I do. I'm at a stage of my life where I forget things. But what I will share with you is another insight which I really haven't emphasized enough in the pre-discussions we had about this. You have wonderful policies, as Fiona said, but a report is not a result. I make my living by going in and trying to bring about the change. And I'll tell you the story. A number of years ago, the Department of Health rang me. Said, we'd like to come into Hawkins House. We want to chat to you about working with us on strategy, etc. It's the kind of stuff I do. So as I would do, if anybody rang me, I would say, would you send me out some relevant reading? Let me get beef them up and tune in and see what the issues are and so on and so forth. And a van arrived at my house the next day, and two guys got out with two large crates of reports and proceeded to bring them in, one on each side carrying the crates in, the big plastic ones you use for moving offices. Now, I later on coined a phrase which said that our institutions, especially in the public service, we're all aware of the DSM and its categorization of mental illnesses. It needs a section on organizational illnesses, and the one I want to get in is severe implementation deficit disorder, because they really do suffer from an embedded condition that makes it very reluctant to implement. The one or two things, again, I'm remembering, one of the things that you get duped into believing that there's progress when you have events like this and you have people getting up and talking about wonderful things they've done in Mayo or Cork or West Limerick or Dublin, and they're like pilot projects. And so there's a great excitement with this kind of show and tell. Well, look, as you go forward and you're looking at implementation, I'm on the Sláinte Care, I was on the Sláinte Care Implementation Advisory Council, and we would attend sessions where you had all these innovations, new innovation, and wherever from around the country. But they have to become systemic. And do not be duped into believing that there's progress when somebody has a show and tell, a walk on part, and talks about the great successes of what they did in their organization. There must be a much more systemic approach to implementation. And finally, I will say that this was a major issue early on, having a seat at the top table. Number one recommendation of a Vision for Change was a director of mental health services. That's been in and out of the picture. It's not clear where it is. And you watched with Sláinte Care implementation, there are going to be 6 regions. And that's where a lot of the action will be, especially implementation of the various initiatives you would like to see. You need a place at the top table. The management internally needs a dedicated team, because the work of implementation constitutes an additional large bubble of work over and above the day job. And you cannot bolt it on to the busy schedule of people who are already overstretched. So you must look for that. You must look for where is the implementation engine, the program office. And then the final thing I'll mention, I could obviously talk about it a lot, is external reporting, public reporting on progress. If you look at, I've been on the Commission on Policing, if you look at the impact that the policing authority has on the guards, because it sets up office in a hotel or down in Dublin Castle, and the guards have to come in and give an account of their stewardship in public. And the final thing I'll mention about implementation, ban the word challenging, because when I hear a minister saying, we're going to deliver X number of jobs or positions, or we're going to do this, but like it's going to be challenging, don't fall for that. Ask them, what will they do that they think you can be held accountable for, but do not be duped into that. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So I know it won't be challenging to ensure that we keep in time with our panel. So thank you very much, Eddie, for that. So Caroline, talk to us a bit about your time as chairperson of MHR. The coalition was focused on driving key reforms in the mental health system, including the implementation of A Vision for Change, obviously, and the reform of the Mental Health Act. How did you ensure that these reforms were prioritized by government? What kinds of challenges did you encounter? And I suppose building on what Eddie was saying, especially when politicians are saying it's going to be challenging to do this, how did you actually make sure that they didn't fob you off?
Well, I think that the first thing, and it kind of picks up a little bit again of what was said this morning, what Eddie said, in order to make mental health reforms priorities and agenda, which in the early stages was very clearly focused on implementation of a Vision for Change, Director for Mental Health Services with a clear accountability and legislative reform at that stage. To be able to bring that to the political setting and to move it forward, we needed to have a legitimate, strong coalition that had an integrity in terms of how it worked, had a legitimacy in terms of the voice it was bringing, and had the resources and the skills to bring that forward in a political setting. And I think for that to happen, I would have to say, and it kind of brings it back, initially when I was involved, it wasn't on the board, it predated the board. And as Fiona was saying, you're going back to 2006, and those 5 organizations that were around. The effort and the time and the reflection that went into how do we create a coalition in a sector, which again, so interesting to see your 53 organizations and all of that work, but in a sector where everyone was working and working effectively, but where bluntly the competencies and skills around policy, advocacy, campaigning wasn't well developed comparatively to other sectors. So to do that, that required vision and trust in those initial organizations, because there's always risk involved. As a small organization or a large organization, am I going to cede some control? Am I going to cede where some of my funding comes from? How do we ensure we have a legitimacy? So for that to happen, we had to build the coalition strongly. And there was a couple of key things within that. We had to have really hard discussions. Who can be a member and who cannot? How do we structure our board? Is it representative? Is it competency based? Where do we get the skilled staffing? Where do we and how do we accept funding? Is that going to compromise? What are the values that are underpinned? What is the space we need to be in? And that took time. And it is fascinating to me, frankly, to be back 10 years on and to see so much of that work still reflected in what Fiona is saying. And I think it's a testament to the trust and the commitment and the work that was done. So that meant when we were going to a political system, we are going with confidence and with credibility. And that work is sustained. I think the second piece in terms of, as I say, pushing it through, there has to be something in it. There had to be a sense of this is now a political point and this is an issue and you have to resource the political system. And one of the key innovations I think there was in terms of that focus on developing means for communication within the political system, cross-party work. And here I absolutely would have to say and give credit to, again, we were a coalition that didn't know how to do this. There was an organization and it was Amnesty who were equally, they were funded beside us. So almost like what Eddie is saying that the HSE need to do in terms of implementing change, we needed nearly to be shadowed. And we were shadowed in that way. We got funding from a philanthropic, so did Amnesty. And at that time, there was a trust such that there was a handover of staff, knowledge, resourcing, helping us and creating that cross-political support and resourcing us to go in and allow, if you like, politicians and others to have the means and the resources to bring the agenda forward. I think that was incredibly important for that. And that focus on pivoting and changing. We knew what our values were, we knew what our priorities were, but the world, as we now know, can change in an instant. And how do you change? How do you keep true to what you're doing, but recognize that there is a need for change? And I think mental health reform did that very well at various times when we went into recession, into pandemic, and into how do we change, how do we structure? And all of that, I'd say, is underpinned by relationships, positioning, and to somebody was saying this morning, that face-to-face. There was knowledge and trust within the organizations, a willing to give and a willing to commit. And I think that certainly influenced how we worked in those first few years.
Which essentially is the definition of mental health, isn't it? You know, being able to relate, which is really walking the walk. So from a, I suppose, service user point of view, Robert can give us an insight. What your perspective of what changes have you seen over the years, Robert, especially in the last decade, in relation to mental health reform? Just tell us a little bit about how you got involved.
Yeah, well, how I got involved with, I was with, is that on? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was with, I was Amnesty first with a man, the service by experience, average user by experience. Now when I finished, I only had it for a brief period of time. Now I went to mental health reform. But the greatest thing that mental health reform, it gave the average users a voice, which they never had before. And people actually listened to them, the HSE in particular. And it meant that there was a broader participation of as average users in different boards in the HSE and the place like that, you know. And it was very good. And it was a well recognized organization. It is now mental health reform. And I mean, it's the main organization for mental health. We were listened to by the government, you know. And also, I think that was the main change, that they actually gave the average user a voice, which they never had before, which is very important, you know, because I mean, they can tell the people how they like things to be done in the mental health services, know how the HSE think it should be done, how they want to be treated and things like that, you know. So,
and you said you're very passionate about people presenting to A&E.
yeah, well, my passion about that is, if you have a mental health illness and you go to A&E, you have to go to A&E. You have no choice but to go to A&E. And you've already had a history with the psychiatric department in the hospital. They won't fast track. You still have to spend your 8 or 9 hours in the and A&E and see a psychiatrist. And if you're psychotic, it's not the best place to spend. I mean, nobody wants to go in here anytime, but I mean, it's best you're psychotic. I mean, they should have some sort of like a triage nurse in a psychiatric hospital who can assess the person, already have their history. You know, so I mean, I can't understand why they won't do that. They keep saying to me that people that present with a mental illness sometimes have a physical problem. That's why I had to go to A&E. But I mean, you know, if you go to A&E on a Saturday night, it's like a war zone, you know. And the last thing you need to be is there, you know.
Which is probably the worst place.
Worst
to
place.
be. Yeah. Eddie, what's it like for you now, you know, 10 years on with MHR, you know, and just hearing a service user like Robert sharing his experience and seeing how, because, you know, you and Caroline very much work at policy level, you know, and you're kind of thinking ahead all the time, but seeing the fruits of your work, because it's, you know, committee meeting after committee meeting, you know, it's hard work to do and often not appreciated enough.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, you know, be negative about it. I suppose I want to be hard-nosed about it. And if you take that example that we've just had of we don't like access through A&E. I've been through A&E with my son who has serious mental illness, and it's a terrible experience, okay? And it doesn't usually result in any, the person wants to run away, okay? So I'm familiar with that. But that's been on the table for 10 years, all those 10 years. So it's an example of a very specific, concrete recommendation, request, demand, in treaty, and it hasn't happened. So I keep there has definitely been progress. There's massive consciousness raising. I can remember when the recovery model was a big deal that people were, and it wasn't even propagated throughout the system. So a lot of progress has been made. There's a lot of enlightenment among the general public. I can recall when they would say there are no votes in mental health. I think there are now, to put it crudely. So yeah, it's fantastic. It's terrific. And that research we've just seen this morning is very illuminating. I put one word about the Sláinte Care vision and the reform of the health service generally, of the mental health services. The holy grail is integration. Integration. And if you look at the 53 organizations, it's about all the cross-cutting issues. It's about the care pathways right across that jigsaw puzzle, including voluntary sector, public sector. And that's why the action is going to take place at regional level among the 6 regions. You can't drive that from the center. It's only on the ground that people know all the moving parts. So when you're talking to the department about implementation, you need to actually work with the 6 regions. It's going to be resource intensive work. So they're the remarks I would make. You know.
Thank you. And I suppose that for you, Caroline, it's just like, you know, say the point about A&E. So how do you make sure that issues like, you know, there is obviously some issues the government takes on going, oh yeah, that's a great idea, let's run with it. And there are some issues that they're just lagging behind. So how can you keep the pressure on to make sure that all the issues are being advanced and some are not just left behind and forgotten about?
Well, I think 2 things. I think persistence, don't make the obvious, but when you look at something like the Mental Health Act, for example, when you think that the Mental Health Act is a 2001 act, I think it was at least 2006 before parts of it were implemented. We had a review that was announced, then the review gets published in 2015. We're still waiting on implementation. Now, at one level, you could look at that and say, you know, have we made any progress at all over that? But I think, well, we have. There is miscellaneous provisions that specifically got changes in, say, ECT and in consent to treatment for voluntary patients, which you might sometimes forget. But I think there's a way in terms of saying sometimes the very big ask is hard, but there's ways of within that position, seeing where you can have low-hanging fruit and make changes, and in a way that you can move it on. So I think the persistence is an important feature. I have to say as well, in terms of where we are and where we've come from, in terms of issues, it's not just about the policy change in terms of A&E and otherwise, but it's things like, for me, things like, where is the independent complaints mechanism within that? So whether I'm going through A&E or another way, or how I'm being treated when I'm presenting and looking at the reports, it seems to me that there's other ways that are cross-cutting. So if you had an independent complaints mechanism, that then gives a means for people to build that evidence base that assists in moving things forward. And I think that's important. And developing the competency, capacity, and confidence of people to complain. That I know what works, I know what my rights and entitlements are, and I'm assisted if necessary to advocacy or independently to voice that. And I think that, but I have to say, it's eyes on the prize and that persistent, consistent ability for long term.
Because otherwise things are just not going to change. Because you need the Roberts of this world to come forward and say, look, this worked for me, this didn't work for me, but that takes, again, huge amount of courage and energy and commitment and just keeping the eyes on the prize. So how do you do it, Robert, after all these years, still very much speaking out and very much being present and sharing your story in the effort to advance the movement?
Oh yeah, I say it all the time, any meeting I'm at or any conference or anything, I always bring it up as a subject, but hopefully to do something about it eventually, but I mean, as that lady said, you have to chip away at it. It's like a little bit at a time, and just try and get them to find out. But as the lady said, it's if they had a complaints procedure, it would be much better because you have some power then to say you're going to complain about it. But like, you know what it's like in A&E, there's nobody to speak to, nobody to talk to, nobody to complain to, because they're all too busy, so.
So we have 5 minutes left before we go on for a little break. So I just wanted to very quickly ask each panelist, what can the people here today and the people who are joining us from home do to advance the issues that you mentioned, let's say the independent complaints process or in relation to accessing A&E when you're in a crisis? What can the people here today do to actually be part? Because that's what the beauty about mental health reform has always been, the collective approach. You gain the trust of the 50 odd organizations, and then you are able to now position yourself in this at the decision-making table. So what can because I think it's like you're able to do this because you have all these organizations behind you, so what can they do in their own communities, in their own organizations to advance the movement, Eddie?
Well, one of the things that's striking about a nationally distributed service like the police or the health services is the patchiness of the service. And I can remember, I think it was North and South Kildare, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was South Kildare, the staff, the social workers, the psychiatric nurses, the whole team figured out a way to have a single telephone contact for people who were in distress over the weekend. So they organized that among themselves, but they didn't have it in North Kildare or Offaly or Tipperary, anywhere else. So you have these pockets of initiative. And I think that for instance, we say you have to go through A&E with a mental health difficulty. There's nothing to stop Kerry Hospital or Letterkenny Hospital organizing it differently. And I think chipping away, and while I talked earlier about innovations being like islands of innovation, those islands of innovation are very important because they create proof of concept, which then you can try to leverage. So I would think work where you can work. You're probably not going to be able to shift the government. That's for the mental health reform and the collective to do. But I think there's lots of scope, lots of things that can be happening. And you find such huge variation in how police handle violence against women in one sector, in another sector. So there's a huge amount of scope for local action on the ground, pick an issue, go after it, and try to get the thing happening locally,
Thank you, Eddie.
and then publicizing that.
Thank you. And Caroline, your call to action for people here today.
I think it's, and I pick up what Eddie has said in terms of where's the future going to be in terms of mental health systems. And if it is going to be regionally and locally, is the massive challenge, but the ability to replicate what we have learned as a collective on a national front, locally and regionally. Massively challenging, but hugely exciting. And I do think, and very much as somebody who's now been on the outside looking in for a period of time, I think what you have all achieved nationally, I think is a model bluntly for how to advocate and collaborate and retain independence and integrity. And I think there's a huge excitement in potentially modeling that locally and providing the basis and the structure for doing that. So I think that would be where I'd focus.
Thank you, Caroline. And Robert, for you, call to action for the people here and people at home, how can
Well,
we?
my call to action would be to anybody has to go or a friend or has to bring something in, you'd make it plain to them and contact your TD or whatever, your councillor, make a complaint to them. And that's the only way you get action, because they think they're going to lose votes to do something about it.
Thank you.
So that's what I would advise people to do.
Thank you very much, Robert. So my thanks to Dr. Eddie Malloy, Director and Advanced Organisation and former Chairperson of Mental Health Reform, to Caroline McGrath, Barrister and former CEO of Mental Health Reform, and of course, Robert McCarthy, mental health activist and board member of Mental Health Reform. Let's give them all a round of applause for them.